mean, if you're a college football fan now, I want you to think about what I'm about to say. The state of Mississippi, your initial thoughts are a couple of programs in that state at the SEC level that usually don't contend at the national level. So unless I'm a fan of those teams, I don't pay a whole lot of attention. That may be what most of you think. The state of Mississippi could be the most fascinating state in all of college football this year. Think about the 2-year transitional period we've had here. If I were to have frozen you in the cryo chamber that we use hypothetically sometimes on the show, the last thing that you remember as I thaw you out right here in the studio is you remember Matt Luke and you remember Joe Moorhead and you probably remember yawning. All due respect to those guys, great position coaches, just probably weren't ready for the head coaching spotlight quite yet. Well, as you're heating up over here from your cryo freeze the past 2 years, imagine your look on your face when I tell you, oh, the Matt Luke, Joe Moorhead days, those are gone. We went and got Lane Kiffin and Mike Leach. How's that sound? You're on the first thing, smoke into the Magnolia State. That's how it sounds. So think about what this year could include, because I'm a believer that you don't have to look at the SEC West and just say, oh, it's Alabama, no one else matters. That's a myth. It's a fact that Alabama is the best program in college football. It's a fact they set the pace. It's a fact they're doing what no other team in the history of college football has done. But even having said that, over the last 11 years, I think they've won the division 6 times and not won it 5 times. It's an every other year situation on average. And that's why I'm not predicting either one of these to make it to Atlanta. But what I'm saying is this is not a sport. It hasn't been, even in this remarkable run for Alabama, where you could just afford to automatically stamp them every year. It seems that way. I pick them to win the West every year because I think they're the best team in the West every year. They don't always win the division. The best team doesn't always win the division. It's a crazy sport. Even when you recruit like they do, it's a crazy sport. So even if you seed the West, okay, for argument's sake, even if you seed the West to Alabama, the second point is still valid. And you know this if you watch Late Kick. We are not a show that defines mattering as does it pertain to the college football playoff? If yes, it matters. If no, it doesn't. We don't think like that. There's a lot that's great about this sport that doesn't necessarily have automatic playoff implications on it. So consider the possibilities for both of these programs this year. At quarterback alone, you got Matt Corral, and we know that at Ole Miss. And again, that's a guy who, at the very least, to start the season, is in the conversation as being the best in the SEC to start the season. Now, once we see what Bryce Young is, once we see what JT Daniels brings, I saw somebody I thought ridiculously put Emory Jones way up there the other day. Well, listen, maybe they're right and I'm wrong. But once we see what these guys can do, then it could be a different story. But right now, I've seen Matt Corral. I hadn't seen a lot of these guys. So there's still a lot to be decided. Ole Miss has got a commodity that's proven at quarterback, is what I'm saying. And at Mississippi State, it's Will Rogers that's going to be listed in all your preview magazines. But then you're going to learn the name Jack Abraham, I would imagine at some point this year, as the transfer from Southern Miss, who, if we judge Mike Leach based on his history, is going to end up being the quarterback in the Mike Leach system that just pops out of nowhere, and you say, where did Mike Leach find him? Well, I'm telling you now, here in, July 15th, Colin? The answer is Southern Miss, out of nowhere. If you watch the spring game, which probably a dozen of you and no more did, but if you watch the spring game, you saw him. He can play. That guy can play. He didn't come in there to just be a backup either. That guy can play. Competition is very healthy. So quarterback alone is very intriguing here. And then you take into account both head coaches have track records specifically tied to developing that position. Lane Kiffin's done it before. He knows how to do it. Mike Leach has certainly done it at multiple stops. He knows how to do it. The Ole Miss defensive upgrade, I think significantly, is another big story to watch here. It's, again, the difference in them going into games thinking we need to score 40-plus to win versus thinking we need to score 30. Let's get 30, 31. We feel good there. They don't have to be a great defense, but they do need to improve themselves from 38 points per game given up on average. That's what they do need to improve on. So it goes from that 38 or some odd points per game to fill in the blank. Be a good poll question. I guess it's fill in the blank. How high can they rise defensively? Because I think they upgrade all 3 levels of their defenses. How much do they upgrade, and collectively, what's the product on the field? Now, with Mississippi State, I think it's an overall team thing. There's not like one position unit I circle and say, well, their entire season rides on that. You could play it that way, but I think in totality terms for Mississippi State, what my mind goes back to In a 2-win season last year, what my mind goes back to is not that LSU game in week 1. It's the Georgia game they lost. Barely. They lost. They were huge underdogs. I think it was between 3 and 4 touchdown underdogs to Georgia, and they go into Athens with under 50 scholarship players, and they battled Georgia right to the end. I think they lost by a touchdown. And Will Rogers was the quarterback that day, and Georgia could not run it on him to save their life. It was one of the craziest stat lines you'll ever see. I mean, I think we spent like 10 minutes just reading the rushing statistics on the show. After that game, so they lost that one. They lost the next week. They lost the week after that, but they were playing their best football. And then they capped at the end of the season with a big win. Point spread was, I think, pick 'em, and they houseboated Missouri. First time I ever used that phrase on the show. The reason I make that point is because sometimes what is perceived as a weakening of the team, i.e. transfers, guys quitting, is actually a strengthening of the team at its core. With Mike Leach, make no mistake, he's going to rub a lot of people the wrong way when he comes in. You're going to have a lot of defectors. He knew that. If he would have had to have put his own money on an over-under transfer, he would have just taken the over. At any number, he would have taken the over. He knew guys were going to leave. He had to have it happen. It's no coincidence that when their roster looked the weakest at the end of the year, they played their best football. Now, do you want to continue to roll into games in the Southeastern Conference with 20 or 25 less scholarship players than you're allowed to have? No, of course not. But it's a process that takes a little bit of time. But I say all that to say, whatever you expect from Mississippi State, there could be a little hardening or gelling that's happening there internally from the guys that actually bought in and actually wanted to be there, that proves itself on the field this year. Because when you look at Ole Miss or Mississippi State, they're both going to be favored to start the season 3-0. Mississippi State will be favored to be 3-0 when they play LSU. Ole Miss will be favored to be 3-0 when they play Alabama. And if you just hit pause before those two games, and both of them are 3-0, you already will have the nation's attention. If either one of them pulls what would be pretty sizable upset or upsets that day, then you'll really grab the nation's attention. But even if they both lose that day, there's a big difference in playing competitive ball in the SEC West versus 66-3 and 62-7. I mean, those were the two scores for Alabama Ole Miss after that 2-year stretch where Hugh Freeze and company beat Bama. So my point is, competitive football will be played in the state of Mississippi this year. Upsets will probably be pulled that you don't expect by a team or multiple teams in the state of Mississippi this year. But at the very least, it's going to be a fun state to watch. Almost sounds like we're talking about high school football. We're talking about SEC football.